share screen and welcome you all to tonight's Historical Society meeting. This is the last Boynton Beach Historical Society meeting of the evening, or of the season, excuse me. Welcome. My name is Ann Rimler, and I'm president of the Boynton Beach Historical Society. At tonight's meeting, we will conduct a required vote for the society. The April 22nd, 2024 meeting of the Boynton Beach Historical Society will now come to order. The bylaws state that those members present and voting shall constitute a quorum. The chair declares a quorum. The first item of business is the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda as presented on the screen? If you would like to propose a change, please type the change in chat. I'll pause a moment. Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Thank you. The next item of business is nominees. The chair calls on Sheila Russo Taylor to give the nominating committee report.
It all works, however you want to say it. Thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of the nominating committee, which includes Virginia Farish, we are pleased to nominate the following officers who have agreed to run for re-election and 2 trustees who have consented to run for another term. We also nominated 2 first-time candidates, one for the first VP for programs and a new trustee. The candidates are as follows: Ann Rimler, President. First Vice President Programs, Angela Budano. Second Vice President Membership, Sheila Russo Taylor. Secretary, John Shelley. Treasurer, Robert Taylor. Trustee, Donna Artez. Trustee, Chada Shelley. And Trustee, Adam Russo. On behalf of the committee, I move the nominations forward.
Since the motion is from a committee, it carries an automatic second. Thank you to the members of the nominating committee. Your work has been completed for another year. You have heard the nominations from the committee. Nominations from the floor are open. After each position is named, you will have an opportunity to move an additional nominee by entering their name in chat. You must have prior consent of the person you are nominating. Ann Rimler has been nominated for president. Are there any further nominations for president? If so, please enter the name in chat. John, I'm sorry, did you mean to nominate someone for president? You're muted. You can unmute yourself.
Sorry. I thought we had a co-trustee, Barbara Reddy.
That's not going to be elected at this, that's not going to be processed at this meeting.
Okay.
Okay, seeing no further nominations for president, nominations for president are closed. Angela Budano has been nominated for her first term on the Board of Directors as First Vice President, Programs Chair. Are there any further nominations for First Vice President, Programs Chair? If so, please enter the name in chat. Seeing no further nominations for First Vice President Programs Chair, nominations for First Vice President Programs Chair are closed. Sheila Russo Taylor has been nominated as Second Vice President Membership. Are there any further nominations for Second Vice President? If so, please enter the name in chat. Seeing no further nominations for Second Vice President Membership, nominations for Second Vice President Membership are closed. Robert Taylor has been nominated as Treasurer. Are there any further nominations for Treasurer? If so, please enter the name in chat. Seeing no further nominations for Treasurer, nominations for Treasurer are closed. John Shelley has been nominated for Secretary. Are there any further nominations for Secretary? If so, please enter the name in chat. Seeing no further nominations for Secretary, nominations for Secretary are closed. Chada Shelley, Donna Artes, and Adam Rousseau have been nominated for 3 trustee positions. Are there any further nominations for a trustee position? If so, please enter the name in chat. Seeing no further nominations for a trustee position, a nomination for trustees are closed. Our bylaws state the following: if there is more than one candidate per office, or if a majority request of members present, the elections will be by ballot. Otherwise, the elections will be by voice vote, one office at a time, or the entire slate may be elected by acclamation on a 2/3 vote of those present and voting. You may unmute yourself, and all those in favor of electing the slate by acclamation, please ensure that you are unmuted. And say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
All opposed, please say no. The chair declares the slate approved by acclamations. Congratulations, and thank you all for your willingness to serve. The newly elected officers will assume their position at the close of tonight's meeting. This concludes the business of the annual meeting, and the meeting is adjourned.
Great job.
Thank you. At this time, participants will be muted so that we may begin our program. Please welcome our interim program chair, Bob Taylor, to introduce tonight's speaker. Bob?
Thank you, Ann, and good evening to everybody. Before I turn the program over to Tommy Stroud, Executive Director of the Lake Worth Drainage District, I'd like to share some background information with all of you. The district was established in 1915. It encompasses 200 square miles in southeastern Palm Beach County and operates as an independent special district. The district provides comprehensive flood control, water conservation, and water supply protection. Tommy Stroud, PE, professional engineer, was appointed as executive director of the district in March of 2019. Tommy joined the district in April of 2014 and served as the director of operations and maintenance. He has more than 45 years of experience in civil, environmental, and water resource engineering in the private and public sectors. Prior to joining the district, Tommy served as the assistant executive director of operations, maintenance, and construction for the South Florida Water Management District. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Oceanographic Technology from Florida Institute of Technology and is a professional engineer registered in the state of Florida since 1983. This evening, Mr. Stroud will discuss the establishment of the Lake Worth Drainage District in 1950 to drain lands for food production, how the district has modified its mission over the years to meet the water supply demands of the ever-growing population, and how the district continues to meet the challenges of providing these services today. And now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Tommy Stroud.
And
Thank you,
Tommy,
Bob.
you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Let me do this. And then I will. Can you see the presentation?
I can, yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank Bob for the eloquent introduction. I appreciate that. I mean, it's an honor for me to present our history to you. A lot of people don't have much information or much knowledge about the Lake Worth Drainage District. They don't understand exactly what we do. A lot of people think their water bills, sewer bills, those kind of things come from Lake Worth, or they think we're part of Lake Worth Beach, the city. But as Bob mentioned, we have a long history stretching back to its inception when the Florida legislature created us in 1915. And we were created as a single purpose district, which was really just focused on drainage and primarily, water resources. We discharge water to prevent flooding, but during dry times like now, we bring water into our system to perch the water table, so to hold water levels in your lakes and your communities, provide supplemental irrigation for agriculture, etc. We have 50 lateral canals that run east-west. You can see these colored lines on this map. This blue area represents our boundary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's basically Okeechobee Boulevard to the Broward County line between I-95 and the Arthur R. Marshall Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. So these colored lines represent canals that provide drainage and water supply. And there's one, as you go from north to south, you cross one, if you're on Military Trail or Congress or the Turnpike, you'll cross one of our canals about every half mile. That was a design that was created in 1915. And the insight of those engineers and construction managers have allowed it to handle a population that is many, many times larger than what was ever anticipated. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We have 20 major water control structures that release water from the system or bring water in via pumps. And because we now have a large urban population, we have permits that allow adjacent developments and areas to connect to our system. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I described earlier kind of what our boundaries were. You can see it a little more clearly here. It's about 200 square miles. We have all or part of 13 municipalities reside within our district. pretty much, well, actually, the population that resides within Lake Worth Drainage District is about 1/2 the population of Palm Beach County. And again, you can see from Boca Raton, Boynton Beach, Delray, Green Acres, Lake Clark Shores, Lake Worth Beach, and even portions of Wellington and West Palm Beach. So we have a wide and very diverse service area, and we're sandwiched in between a very precious natural resource, the Loxahatchee Wildlife Refuge, and the Lake Worth Lagoon and the Atlantic Ocean. So our operations not only affect the human populations that reside within our boundaries, but we have the potential to impact natural systems. So we have to be very careful how we manage all of those conflicting objectives. We're governed by a 5-member board of supervisors elected by the landowners. And that's a little different. It's not a general popular election. These special districts were intended to benefit the landowners within the district. And what that did was it avoid the broader county, Palm Beach County, from having to pay for drainage improvements in a smaller isolated area. So basically the landowners within the boundaries are the ones that fund the improvements and the continued maintenance of the system. And those landowners elect the board of supervisors that represent them. Our fiscal year begins October 1st. We have an annual budget of about $18 million, and that's been relatively unchanged in the last 10 years. It's supported by a non-ad valorem assessment on the properties, which is assessed per acre, and the current rate is $49.50 per acre. One of the things I kind of want to point out at the start of this, before I go through the succession of years and changes that have occurred, I kind of want to take a step back and give you a visual representation of just how dramatically the landscape has changed since 1915 to today. This image here is an aerial photograph. It was photographed in 1940 by the Navy. They recognized that a world war may be on our doorstep, and they prepared for that by taking aerial imagery pretty much of the entire United States, but particularly the coastal margins. And so Florida was obviously an area of importance for that. So this is basically a photograph looking straight down from a very high altitude. And it doesn't look like much. You can't recognize anything. What you see are these broad gray or white areas, and you see these small dark spots and areas. These are natural wetlands, these lakes. Water in this image shows up dark. Dry areas show up light or light gray. So what you see here is kind of a mosaic of pine flatwoods interspersed with isolated wetlands. And every now and then you'll see something that looks like a river system. It's actually a slough, a wetland slough, which allowed water to move off these higher lands down into lower areas. The bottom line was this was totally a natural system. Many people consider it Everglades. And in fact, the Everglades border us pretty much where the current boundary is today in the Loxahatchee Refuge. And that was 1940. So nothing had changed really, even though we had dug a number of canals between 1915 and 1940. Most of the farming was over on the eastern side, pretty much near where I-95 is, Congress Avenue is today. But as you got into the 50s and the 60s, you started seeing agriculture move west, and it could only do that based on the infrastructure that the Lake Worth Drainage District had designed and constructed. Here you see one of our canals in this square mile. This is a square mile of land. And the farmers came in and they leveled the land. They constructed secondary ditches and pump stations so that they could drain the land for vegetable farming into our canal. Then our canals would take it out to the ocean and provide drainage. And that pretty much the entire district was devoted to agriculture in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But in the 70s, you started to see a marked change in land use, starting around where Interstate 95 is today and moving slowly westward past Military Trail, Jog Road, and the 441, which back then was called Range Line. And you can start to see construction of lakes, construction of individual homes, and drainage patterns to provide drainage to them. And then they connected to our major drainage canal network to provide drainage. So that was in the mid to late 70s. By the early 1990s, a lot of areas have been completely developed into urban land uses, and that was continuing. And so you would see these farms that have been operating for 30, 40 years or longer, selling their property to developers, and developers coming in and constructing the lake systems and stormwater systems that at that time were required and still are by the South Florida Water Management District. And then, of course, today, that same area is now totally urbanized. You can see tiny little remnants of agriculture here just west of the turnpike, but there's very little agriculture left east of the turnpike, and we see that trend continuing. So the bottom line of this story is no one could live in South Florida, particularly in the Lake Worth Drainage District, in 1915. It was uninhabitable. You could live over on the Sand Ridge, which is about where the Flagler Railroad, the railroad is, and 95 is, but it was impossible to homestead successfully in these wetland areas. But because the drainage system we put in place, it went from Everglades to urban development in less than a century. And so as we go through the progression of years, think about that dramatic progression of land use and ask yourself, how does it still function today when it went from being flooded almost all year long to today rarely flooded, except during major storm events? What had to transpire for that to occur? And it's more than just an engineering technological feat. It's an organizational, governmental story that had to come together for all this to happen. So prior to 1915 and the establishment of the district, there were many real estate promoters that sold hundreds of tracts of undrained land, touting Florida as a tropical paradise. Everybody recognized its value, but in 1915, they saw it as only for agriculture. Nobody was really taking vacations and traveling across the country in 1915. There were just T-model Fords and railroads around at that time from transportation's perspective. So a development company called Palm Beach Farms, Percy Hagerman was the president, saw there was development potential. Now they were out of Colorado, the group of investors that put this company together. And they had an associate who was an engineer. He was a mining engineer, Orrin Randolph. And he was friends of that group and came up with the idea that they could use ditches in South Florida to divert water and drain the land and make it productive for agriculture. So together, Randolph Hagerman succeeded in dredging about 70 miles of canal in the early 1900s. And in May of 1915, Orrin Randolph was appointed the first chief engineer of the Lake Worth Drainage District, and he developed a plan of reclamation that was created to define the means and methods by which this drainage would occur. And in 1915, that was technologically was pretty astounding. Big dredges were just coming into generalized use. It was not something that existed commonly. There was some work done by the state. That he used as somewhat of a template. It required a lot of surveying. That's what you see here, these guys in these longboats. He developed this initial plan, which is just a small piece of what we operate and maintain today. And these dredges I mentioned earlier, again, were just unheard of. And in fact, each one of them was custom built. They would build it at where they wanted to start digging, then they would dig through the landscape, And then when they were done, they would take it apart, either sell it to another entity, or they would dispose of it. So on July 10th, 1915, the first district landowners meeting was held. That meeting took place at Palm Beach County Courthouse. This time, the district consisted of about 83,000 acres, and the assessment was 25 cents an acre, as opposed to the almost $50 we have today. Because of World War I, there was a lack of manpower and supplies available for canal construction at the onset of World War I, and it's threatened to stop operations. So in response, the district kind of focused its efforts on surveying to kind of identify the rights of way needed for the canals and do that necessary land work, and with anticipation of starting the construction after World War I. So the canal system was put to the first of many tests to come in 1923, where that plan of reclamation had pretty much been constructed. And the district received about 18 inches of rain in a 3-day period. And the district records at the time indicated, this was a quote, "Canals operated as designed and the land did not flood." So that was a fairly unique occurrence in South Florida at that time, to have an area subjected to significant rainfall and not cause flooding that could damage agricultural operations. And as an engineer, I'm kind of a little bit of a geek. And so it's really interesting to me how people designed back in those days. They had no computers. They had slide rules and graph paper. That was pretty much it. And it was quite an effort to take. And they had very little data. They didn't have a lot of rainfall data. They had very little water level readings. And so to come up with a system that after 100 years still functions at that level of technology with that little information is really astounding to me. And of course, like I mentioned, World War I was a big impact to the improvement. So they focused on surveying, which back then was mules, wagons, and surveyors that were literally cutting through the Everglades and wading through the Everglades in order to determine those land boundaries. And then construction started at the end of World War I. Of course, then you get into what they call the Roaring 20s, and the country was prosperous and property values skyrocketed. The district property went from $25 an acre in 1920 to $250 an acre in 1925. So in just 5 years, it went up tenfold. Then there was the stock market crash, and that initiated the Great Depression. And that was a huge impact to Lake Worth Drainage District because no one could pay their taxes, so there was no revenue to come in. It had an impact on construction, had an impact on the staffing of the agency. And M.A. Weaver, the father of Stanley Weaver, who I'm going to talk to you about more, his son, who was also a board member at the Lake Worth Drainage District. His father, M.A. Weaver, joined the board in 1932 and took a leadership role focused on securing the necessary funding during the Depression to try to keep the construction going of the canal network. And he found help through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a federal, there's Mr. Weaver there, which was a federal program of loans that the district entered into, and it kept the district moving with the reclamation projects. And that's the type of construction that was common back in the 1920s. Obviously, there were lack of regulation and other things. You could never do an operation like that today, but it was state of the art back then. So in the mid-1930s, the country was recovering from the Great Depression, and Florida was one of those fastest recovering states. And at the ends of the district, north end, south end, commercial airfields were being built for tourism and businesses, but this was prior to World War II. And at the onset of World War II, the War Department took over those existing airfields. The Boca Raton Airfield was taken over by the Army Air Corps in 1941. And the Morrison Airfield, which became Palm Beach County Airport at West Palm Beach, was also moved into service by the War Department. Even with war efforts, though, throughout this decade, the district never lost sight of the rehabilitation agenda. At the end of 1945, the district saw the beginnings of a post-wartime building boom once again, and it was clear that more prosperous times were ahead, and that these drainage canals, this infrastructure, was going to be an important part of what was ahead for the district. And there's an example of some of the agricultural canals at the time. So between 1945 and 1955, the district saw a huge influx of urban population. During the 1940s, the landowners came to the district board with complaints of having no drainage or access to water for farming. And we saw those tax receipts plummet. The Board of Supervisors realized that they had to prioritize which canals they were going to construct. And two names you probably heard from driving around the southern portion of Palm Beach County, Clint Moore and August Butts, were two of the many farmers that assisted the district by digging new canals and doing maintenance work on those canals to keep the drainage improvements moving. And there's an example of the E2 canal, which is now adjacent to the Florida Turnpike. Just to give you an example of kind of how things have changed. And that was November 1919. By 1955, the Board of Supervisors turned their attention to the canals running east to west along the west side of Lake Clark. And there was a lot of construction in that area associated with that. And a lot of that land was being converted from agriculture to urban land uses. And this area had become suburbia following the end of World War II. Speculators were creating housing tracts in the areas that were once pasture land for grazing cattle or growing vegetables. But with that speculation came new challenges to the district's ownership of canal rights-of-way. I mentioned the turnpike earlier. And it was designed in the early 1950s, constructed and opened for business in 1957. The 110-mile stretch from Golden Glades in Miami to Fort Pierce included a path through the Lake Worth Drainage District service area. And that expansion promised a faster means of transporting both commerce and people. And as I mentioned earlier, slated to be built adjacent to the turnpike was the E2 canal that I showed you earlier. A major north-south drainage canal had the potential to decrease the agricultural and acreage, possibly hindering flood control. So the concern was building this big road through the middle of the canal network was going to have a negative impact. And the district initially had opposed the construction, but they reached a compromise with the Department of Transportation, where there were two canals constructed on either side of the turnpike. And the E2 was named E2 East, and it was accompanied by a new canal, E2W, on the west side of the turnpike, so that we basically doubled the north-south flow capacity along with the construction of the turnpike. One of the ironies of that today is they're widening the turnpike, if you've driven down it and seen the construction work, and we're having to narrow our rights-of-way somewhat to accommodate that. But again, DOT is being very careful not to impact our flood control capacities and allowing space for us to maintain our canal network. So once again, the turnpike and the state are helping us maintain flood protection by the time this was built, which had already been in place for 50 years. And of course, the question the Board of Supervisors were wrestling with is, could the district keep up with the water supply and flood protection demands of the future increases in population? And there's a Turnpike Plaza there as it was originally constructed. So the district in the 1960s, early 1970s, the district was 50 years old. And, the pop culture was becoming a thing with the space race and the Beatles. But water concerns were on everybody's mind as you saw population increase during that period. And the district's resources were stretched as thousands of people from the Northeast migrated to the area for warmer weather, and a stress-free living. And this decade marked an unprecedented increase in population. And there's an example of Boynton Beach, a Dixie Highway. The Gray Wave was the name that it was associated with the retirees coming down from the north, and it demanded a redirection in services that the district provided. In response, the district conducted a drainage engineering study that established the right-of-way, land rights-of-way that we would need to maintain the capacity for this urban development. And so for the first time since the plan of reclamation in 1915, an engineering study took place that provided an inventory of what lands, what canal dimensions would be needed to provide flood protection for this growing population. And it had to be done in concert with maintaining existing agriculture while providing for newly urbanized land uses. And this is a classic example of what you see in that transformation. Of course, there's the typical ag land. You can see the canals adjacent to it. And when a residential development comes in, they recontour the land, obviously to accommodate the roadways, parking areas, buildings, etc. But it also required the construction of these ponds. And a lot of people assume they are amenities for the residential developments, and they do in fact serve that role, but their primary function is to be a shock absorber for stormwater during major rain events. In other words, when it rains in these farms, they immediately pump the water off into our canal networks. But now you're coming in and you're paving these landscapes, and that precludes water from soaking down into the underlying aquifer. So it creates runoff that needs a place to go. Rather than overwhelming our canals with this new water from this runoff from these impervious surfaces, it's directed into these lakes where it's sort of temporarily detained for a day or so and allowed to bleed out slowly. So the canal network isn't overwhelmed by this new source of or high intensity inflow. So with people, also when people come and build along our canal, we find a lot of unauthorized uses of district rights of way. A lot of people find that it's an opportunity to dispose of debris or other material. And the district works, and we still do, with Palm Beach County Sheriff Office to help patrol our rights of way for trespassers. But I want to be clear that, it's public land. And so we don't discourage people walking along the canal banks. We do prohibit vehicular traffic. But along with that comes the concerns of safety and security for adjacent properties next to our canals. And there were, back in the 70s and 80s, there were public demands to fence the entire rights of way of district canals. And that was made repeatedly before our Board of Supervisors. But economically, it's just simply not feasible. We have 500 miles of canals. That means we would have 1,000 miles of fencing that would be required roughly. And then, of course, you add on that the maintenance and all the other things. It was just not something that the district could take on financially without significantly raising the taxing rates on the residents within the district. So recognizing that conflict, the district initiated a permitting process for new development so that we could kind of get ahead of that concern. And we worked with Palm Beach County. We worked with a lot of the local municipalities, and all of those things were built into their development plans. And so now when you see a new development come in, they'll have fencing on the perimeter. They'll have visual buffers to obstruct the visual site of our canals and just make a better boundary between the function of our canal that needs to be maintained and the urban landscape. And also, as I mentioned, we deal with water supply function. So in 1981, there was a severe drought, and we had to work with all the local entities on how to divvy out the limited amount of water. And so a district-wide evaluation of all the water control structures was obtained to protect that water supply. And in the late 80s, early 90s, significant improvements to our water control structures were made. Here's some of the fencing issues that we had. That was pictures during the drought. And those were some of the improvements to the water control structures that were made subsequently. So it was a decade, 85 to 95 was a decade of proactive response by the district. We had a divergent population, agriculture, urban. We had to provide water for irrigation, but we also had to provide flood control. As I mentioned, we improved our water control structures. We had to expand because of our expanding regulatory program. We had to expand our office building. So we had a new building constructed on site, an additional building with a 2-story west wing. And the district would soon prove itself as a major authority for conveyance of water in southeastern Palm Beach as all of this new development came in. And here's some examples of the newer water control structures that we now operate to provide flood protection and water supply. That was the new building and the board at the time. So between 1995 and 2005 was marked by some pretty significant hurricanes. In 1995, however, the district became embroiled in a legal battle regarding the validity of the court order that established the canal rights of way that we own and that the district had secured back in 1916. Relief was felt in 1996 when the Circuit Court Palm Beach County ruled that the real property obtained through Chancery was valid and stemmed from the original landowner. So we settled that property dispute. And fortunately, because in 2004, we had back-to-back hurricanes that flooded large areas around South Florida. But it severely damaged the district's office, and a majority of staff and thousands of files and equipment were relocated in order to reconstruct that building. On June 15th, 2005, the district ended its decade celebrating its 90th anniversary. And we were preparing for the last decade of the 20th of its 100 years, getting ready for our 100 years anniversary. And as I mentioned earlier, the family name Weaver is synonymous with the Lake Worth Drainage District. M.A. Weaver was one of the initial board members. He worked on the field crew that surveyed the original canals. And in 32, as I mentioned, he was elected to the Board of Supervisors. He served for 28 consecutive years. When he stepped down, his son, C. Stanley Weaver, agreed to take over, and he served at the Lake Worth Drainage District for 47 years as a Board of Supervisors. On his retirement in 2007, the district honored him and his family for their service by renaming the Boynton Canal as the C. Stanley Weaver Canal. And there's a C. Stanley Weaver there. So they were one of the forces that kind of kept the district focused, kept us on track, kept us funded, and accomplished the work necessary to construct all of these canals, but more importantly, to ensure that they were maintainable and that they served their function for over a century. And the district canal network really hasn't changed significantly over that 100 years. And on June 15, 2015, the 100th Board of Supervisors took their oath to continue that mission. So from the very beginning, each board member brought with them a vision. We started with the Everglades and an idea to construct drainage network. That was done. It was successful in bringing agriculture into the county, but then that land use changed dramatically. We went from having a few thousand residents to now having half of Palm Beach County live within our boundaries. And the current Board of Supervisors is just as passionate and steadfast in this same mission. So we're continuing to work together, and we're looking forward to another 100 years of providing drainage and water resource management to Southeast Palm Beach County. So with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. We have questions for you in chat. Um, who are the landowners when you had the original aerial slide up
Mm.
of the farms?
Yes, the first was the Palm Beach Land Company. And they were the ones that I mentioned that kind of were the originators of the idea to develop a drainage district and construct these works. Shortly after that, there were two others that came in. There was like the Yamato family was another big landowner. And the third one escapes me right now. I'll think of it in just a minute. But there were three big landowners that kind of came in and basically became the district. Shortly thereafter, they started subdividing their lands in two areas. They subdivided them on the east side of the district near where 95 is today. And they had 5-acre tracts west in the ag area. And one of their development promotions was, if you buy 5 acres of agricultural land in the drainage district, they would give you a lot in the urban area on the east. And so that was an incentive for farmers from the Midwest to come down and start farming, because the bonus they got was urban land on the higher ground.
Wow, given land, how wonderful. Another question, which companies designed the dredges? Were they steam powered?
Initially they were, yes. Initially they were steam powered. And like I said, I can get the companies' names to you, but they were literally just barge construction outfits, and they weren't very big. It would basically be a company that employed, 10 or 15 carpenters. The steam engines would be designed and constructed on site. So they were kind of wildcat operators, a lot like the early oil fields were. It wasn't big companies that did it. It was a lot of smaller entrepreneurs that got into the business, constructed those early steam-driven dredges, and got them going. Shortly after that, once the internal combustion engine kind of became a thing, with the T models, they went to gasoline and diesel engines, in subsequent years.
Okay, thank you. And as another question, and Sue, is this yours? Help me with the pronunciation. When did the eclipsis trees?
Eucalyptus trees were brought in
Oh,
to help with water. And of course, they became invasive and lots of money spent to get rid of them. So
yes.
Can you talk to us about that?
I can. They were a relative of eucalyptus trees called Melaleuca, and they were native to Australia. The idea was that these things had enormous water use, and so the idea was plant them in the Everglades where it's wet. It'll soak the water up, evaporate it, evapotranspiration, through the leaves and biological respiration. And they thought as a benefit, they're very evasive, so you only have to plant them once, and they'll naturally propagate into huge stands of trees that suck the water out of the land. They were very invasive. They spread all over South Florida. They didn't drain the Everglades the way it was hoped. And in subsequent years, they became just a nemesis for the natural ecosystem in the Everglades. And the state of Florida, Corps of Engineers, federal government has spent tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in their eradication. and it continues to this day.
Thank you.
Thank
Was-
you.
Was the Yamato colony in Boca Raton supplied by water from the canal system?
Yes, yeah, the canal system is basically a matrix of canals that kind of interconnect, and water from the north end can supply needs in the south end and vice versa. And so, yes, the Yamato is kind of down in near the Boca area, and this system provided water and flood protection for them.
And would you tell us a little bit about the Centennial video series?
Oh, yeah, and I just started at Lake Worth Drainage District just before the centennial year. I started in 2014. It was in 2015. And one of the things that the staff put together was a series of videos, basically one video, they're about 10, 15 minutes long, for each decade from 1915 till today. Kind of in the same format that I went through here with these slides. And they did an excellent job. It's almost like they did little PBS, videos, like something you would see, on a historical show on PBS. But it goes through each decade in a very entertaining and informative way. One of the quotes from that I repeat a lot of times. One of the letters from a farmer in 1915 who came down from Nebraska to look at buying land in the Lake Worth Drainage District, wrote a letter to the district and said, I'm used to paying for land by the acre, but I've never paid for it by the gallon. And that was sort of an indication of the frustration a lot of farmers from outside of Florida realized when they came into Florida, and they bought the land a lot of times sight unseen, and they hung all their hopes on the success of this drainage system to get through it. And I think there were some fits and starts, but I believe at the end of the day, it was successful, even for the farmers around the Depression, World War I, in that area.
How deep are the water retention ponds? Are they stocked with fish?
They are. I want to. The depth varies because the developers also use them as a source of fill material to build up the land high enough for the homes and the streets and roads. So depending on the math of how that geometry works, but they can be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet deep.
Wow.
And when you get down into Broward County, where they also serve the purpose of rock mining, in other words, they provided limestone used in road construction, et cetera. Those lakes can be 50 feet deep in some areas.
Wow.
And what was the second part of your question? I apologize.
Are they stocked with fish?
They aren't. Although there have been some communities that have, with permission from the Fish and Game Commission, have brought in tilapia or other fish that eat submerged aquatic vegetation, and they use those fish as a means to keep the lakes clean. Now, the problem is those fish can't escape, so they have to literally be imprisoned with structures that have bars that keep them from swimming out and getting out into the Everglades, the natural ecosystem, and doing damage. So, but the natural recruitment, quite honestly, is pretty astounding. How quickly you find things, alligators, fish, minnows, frogs, turtles, otters, they find their way pretty quickly into these lake systems.
Fascinating. And some of the canals look stagnant. Is mosquito control under your agency?
No, it's not. The county does have a mosquito control office, but for whatever reason, I think because they do a good job, there's not a lot of mosquitoes. We do have some. We don't treat for mosquitoes, but we do treat for floating aquatic vegetation. And the reason for that is that can move with the flow of the water, and it can clog our gated water control structures or our pump stations and severely inhibit the flow. So we have to maintain that type of vegetation, keep it out of the system. And I think that has a secondary impact on mosquitoes.
Did the Florida East Coast Railway play a part in the construction of the canal system?
Not directly, but indirectly, the same state and federal program for providing land for the reclamation of Florida applied to the railroad and to the canal network. So the incentive for people like Flagler and others to come down into Florida and construct the railroad, construct these drainage systems, that land incentive was common to both.
And I've got another question for you. I live on a lake, on a water retention pond, and I noticed that when a lot of rain is forecast, it doesn't even have to be right in my area. My lake is drained. How do they know? How does that whole system work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and a really good question. Very interesting subject, and it's really unique to the Lake Worth Drainage District. The Lake Worth Drainage District realized back in the early 70s that not only did these communities need a way for the water to get out of the lake system to avoid flooding from normal rains as well as major events, but that we needed a way to augment that by allowing the lowering of the lakes during critical time periods. And so a second water control structure with an operable gate, it's got a wheel on it, you can go out and turn it, and to open the gate prior to storm events would increase the amount of water storage capacity in those lakes. In other words, give you a bigger bucket to hold water. I used to use, when my kids were young and they were taking a bath, I said, well, you got to let more water out of the bathtub because they're going to splash it out on the floor. And this was same situation with a hurricane. You lower the lakes so the water doesn't fill up, spill out into the neighborhoods if you can avoid that. And so to answer your question, how it's coordinated, the Lake Worth Drainage District doesn't allow the operation of those operable structures unless we give an all-out kind of permission to do that. And we have very strict sort of time periods, time windows in which those gates can be opened. They need to be opened prior to the storm event, where they need to be closed as the storm event starts to occur. Then the lake system and its passive weir handles the flood event. And then after the storm, if the lakes are unusually high and we see a increased risk from other storms in the near future, then we'll allow them to be opened again to bring those lakes back to normal. And so it's an orchestration operationally that we coordinate and that is unique to the Lake Worth Drainage District.
That's fascinating. What of the development or encroachment of the communities in the ag reserve?
Yes, well, and it's that the encroachment into the encroachment of the communities into agriculture, I guess, that transformation of land use. The county recognized that, agriculture was an important attribute, a land use that needed to be maintained and even protected. And so it established an area of land in the western portion of southeastern Palm Beach County that it would try to conserve agriculture. And so it created what we now call the Ag Reserve. And it puts restrictions on the amount of urban development that can occur on any parcel. In other words, there has to be, I believe it's like 60% of any parcel preserved for either agriculture or for water resource function. And then that leaves only 40% that can be used for urban development. And so, that's been going on for a while. There's been a lot of, it's worked, and I mean, a lot of criticism that it could work better based on the land development approvals that have occurred. but I think it's holding its initial objective of trying to preserve agriculture in that portion of Palm Beach County.
And another question, our area used to provide the predominance of bell peppers to the nations.
Mhm.
Now farms have been flipped for residential use.
Mhm. That's correct. I mean, and you can go back and look at a lot of federal interstate trade, international trade agreements that have been pointed to as a reason for that. A lot of those winter vegetables now come from Mexico, or they're literally shipped in from other countries. There's still some substantial lands in South Florida that are devoted to agriculture. There's, some, as we mentioned, here in Southeast Palm Beach County. There's a significant amount of winter vegetables in southern Miami-Dade County. However, that's at risk, not from land use, but from sea level rise. Those lands are very low. And as the tides continue to rise incrementally, we see the flooding of those lands increasing, not only in stage, but in the duration of flooding. And so it's a warning sign that those areas may not be productive for much longer. Some other areas, like in western Palm Beach County, the sugar farms, they grow a lot of winter vegetables, corn, peppers, and the like. And so there still is those entities in South Florida that take advantage of South Florida's unique climate, but it's diminishing over time, and the reliance on foreign sources is increasing, unfortunately.
Thank you. Debbie says, thank you for the program. Gail says, thank you for a fascinating program. And does anyone have other questions? You may unmute yourself or enter your question in chat. Thank you, Tommy, for a great
Thank you.
program.
I enjoyed it. It was an honor to be here, and I really appreciate y'all's interest in it. And you can call us, come by and see us anytime. We'd be glad to have you.
Where's your office?
Tommy, thank you very, very much. Enjoyed your program immensely, and I was delighted to be able to introduce you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, and our offices are on the boundary between Delray and Boynton. You drive down Military Trail and you'll see the big blue letters LWDD on the side of the building. So, and of course, go to our website, lwdd.net, and all of this information and a lot more is there. Plus the videos that were mentioned earlier, they're all online, and we encourage you to go see them and reach out to us anytime. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, terrific program.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. This is our last public program for the season. We'll be back in the fall. Keep an eye on our website for dates, and we'll send program notices and, of course, the historian newsletter if you're a member. If you're not a member, please reach out and become a member. We'd love to have you join us. Have a great night. Thank you, everyone.
Great program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you.